What are we talking about this week? Like, what did we talk about?
It was living preferences, my friend. The living preferences of the Cusp generation. We wanted to get, down to understanding what this pandemic is going to do in terms of how our generation of, young people want to live.
Is that because you're currently living at home, Anka? I'm living by myself downtown. Tony, I don't even know where you are right now. Are you at home? Are you downtown? I have no idea.
No, I'm in the burbs. I'm staying with my
suburbs.
rents. Yeah.
Yeah. And what Tony and I are doing is actually pretty common. Like, I was reading prior to the call that over half of young Americans right now are living with their parents, and over 2 million
What about
Canadians.
Do we have the Canadian statistic?
Well, over 2 million Canadians. This was back in July, but over 2 million Canadians that were young Canadians had already moved back in with their parents, right? And so you're seeing a whole bunch of people who are kind of just staying with the rents. And why not? There's all these rising case numbers. There's a lot of economic uncertainty.
It's definitely facilitated by COVID. If COVID wasn't happening, I'd still be living on close to campus.
I actually noticed not too long ago that, because I play music quite loudly in my apartment sometimes. So I always feel like, my neighbor's listening. But then I realized out of the other 7 units on my floor, only mine and one other one are occupied right now. Everyone else has left or gone somewhere else.
Wow.
Including the very nice grandma and her 2 granddaughters that were my direct neighbors. Because the granddaughters went to a ballet school super close to where I live, and she used to take care of them. And then I met her just at the beginning of COVID in the elevator, and she's like, "Oh, you're still here?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I'm still here." And she said, "Oh, I'm moving home." It's like, "What's going on?" She's like, "I'm moving back to Saskatchewan because the kids aren't going to ballet school anymore. There's nothing for us to do here, so we're all going back home to stay together."
Wow.
So yeah, COVID sent back a lot of people home. It makes sense.
Yeah, man. And I guess this is a great segue to talk about why we wanted to bring on some people to talk about this, because we clearly have seen this as a trend, but we don't really know why this is happening besides COVID, right? And what are some of the underlying trends that are driving these living choices and career choices in terms of what city you choose to live in. And so we brought on, I guess, 2 experts to the pod. So we got not 1, but 2 interviews this week.
Damn. Where did we get the budget for 2?
We got to do more of these, man. These are fun. Tom, you want to tell the listeners about Steven, and then I can talk about Jason?
Sure. I can introduce Steven. So yeah, we wanted to get different perspectives on this pod. And Steven was going to provide us the urban planner perspective. So he studied urban planning in university, and he's been working in the field for quite some time here in Canada. And he's also part of the Cusp generation, right? He's just about in our age zone. So we thought he would provide a really good perspective from the modern urban planner, what they're thinking about, what they're taking into consideration when it comes to developing the city of the future. So really happy that Steven joined us on the pod this week.
Mm-hmm. And then, after Steven, we also had a great conversation with Jason Ribeiro, who is currently the Director of Strategy at Calgary Economic Development. And, Jason,
a big deal.
he won't tell you that himself, but
and strategy in the same title. That's a big deal.
Yeah, he is kind of a big deal. Yeah, big deal energy. But hey, listen, he as big of a profile as he might have in the Calgary scene, is an extremely humble individual, and he came through and talked to us about some trends that he's seeing, both in Calgary and in the greater economy, about the kind of choices that young people are making, about the kind of cities they want to live in. We talked about the impact of the digitization of the economy and how that's going to change people's work lives as well as maybe their commutes and things like that.
I think what was super interesting about Jason's interview, and Tony, correct me if I'm wrong, didn't Calgary just release a future forecast of the city just before COVID hit. I think his like strategy document. What was that called?
Yeah, I think in like 2019, they really set their municipal strategy, which I'm sure it's really useful right now.
Okay, yeah, all those
no, but really, I'm sure it's interesting hearing like how he and other people at that particular city are dealing with all the changes going on, not just because of COVID, although yes, because of COVID, but also because of these other trends we talked about, the digitization of the economy, the vacancy rate in a lot of commercial cores, and then the changing social preferences of the Cusp generation, the millennials that preceded us, and I'm sure this same conversation is going to be had as Gen Zs move into the workforce. So it's a really interesting conversation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Cool. All right. Well, I think we should probably shut up for a bit and let the experts take it away from here, right?
Yeah, let's go.
My name is Stephen Raitz. I currently work as an urban and regional planner with a municipality in the Edmonton region, so City of Beaumont specifically, just south of Edmonton. And I'm there through a planning internship. I just graduated in 2019 from the U of A urban and regional planning program specifically. And yeah, it's been awesome. I work a lot with policy and land development in that position. And I've always kind of been interested in community development. I know two of the guys through this call. That's kind of how I got looped in through residence, which was kind of very formative for me. And then I've always been back in the day, way back when I probably didn't sound as adult, and I was just more so a juvenile having a really good time. But now I'm an adult having a really good time, and I'm involved with a couple of kind of advocacy or sort of city building projects in my free time now. I'm involved with my community league. I'm involved with an active transportation nonprofit, make sure we have safe streets and sidewalks. So I like to get involved, and I'm also an improviser. So I like the idea of this off the cuff conversation that we'll have because I like just thinking of stuff on the spot. We'll see where we go.
So yeah, the boys and I have been talking a lot, and given everything that's happening in the world, COVID is still kind of hanging around. We were very curious about how this is going to affect millennials and Gen Zs and our living choices kind of going forward. But before we talk about the effects of COVID, like pre-COVID, what do you think was some of the general trends when it comes to millennials and Gen Z's living choices? Were people starting to move back home with their parents? Were people still moving into the city, wanting to live downtown? Like, what did you guys notice? And this is for everyone.
I'll take the first stab, and I'll probably set a little bit of a precedent for how I'll answer questions in that. This is a classic planning answer in that, it really depends. There is never a clear, definitive answer, because I have friends who've moved to the suburbs, into their first home, building their first home. I've had friends move to small towns because it's very affordable and they need a car for work, so that's how they're going to get around. I have friends who've moved downtown in apartments. So I would say the common theme for people is that they're just looking for an affordable place to get started. But I think, I think there's this ongoing theme of everybody's sticking at home with their parents, or maybe that might be reintroduced with COVID. I think we'll get to that. But I think a lot of people were just entering, the phase of living on their own kind of thing. And it was working for the most part. They had options. There were affordable places to be going, and that presented itself in a lot of different ways.
So affordability seems to be a key thing you're talking about. It's how can you kind of find the place that fits your budget and find the place that fits your lifestyle and what have you.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of the time we think of housing affordability, but really affordability is a conglomerate of factors. It's how much do you pay for rent, or if you're going to get a mortgage, is that going to be expensive? But then it's also transportation costs too. Do I have to have a car if I live here? And then do I have to take on all the associated maintenance fees, insurance, all that sort of stuff, the actual cost of purchasing a car if you don't already have one, or do I have other options where I can get around affordably and reliably? And then also just, the cost of goods in a certain area. Like it's clear that living in a denser place, living in a downtown, usually that's accompanied by more expensive services and products, like higher end chains and that sort of thing. And the further out you go, there can be more affordable options layered in. So yeah, it's a bunch of different factors coming together for affordability. And I think I would say millennials or Gen Z or people who are the cusp, I don't think we think of it in that way, but I think we should, because that would help us manage our budgets better if we thought about all the different factors coming together other than housing.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think whenever I talk to people about, hey, what city do you want to live in? They're like, Vancouver has high rent prices. Toronto has high rent prices. Calgary this. But no one ever talks about, what about the cost of owning a car? Do you need to, what is the cost of public transit? Yeah, those conversations don't come up as often as I think they should.
Well, one thing that I noticed, I think just a little bit of a pivot into the conversation around COVID, but I mean, pre-pandemic, a lot of these, you're right, Stephen, a lot of the conversations, at least I was having with my friends, was like, yo, can I be near public transit? I want to be in downtown. I want to be where it's bumping, where things are going on, right? But do you think that has changed a little bit in the sense that people might be more afraid to take public transit now because of concerns around catching COVID, or B, people might be more afraid to be in more dense areas like a downtown right now because again of concerns of catching COVID, just because the correlation between density and potentially catching the disease?
Yeah, so we can pick that apart a little bit, because we see some of the densest places on Earth have really been able to handle this much better than suburban places in the United States, for example. There's a stark contrast where you see places with lower density actually failing phenomenally and places with higher density succeeding. And so I think it's a rational human fear to think that way, but the way that our society has changed over the last little bit and how we interpret and act on public health measures really should mitigate those concerns for the most part. Masking up on public transit, for the most part, should deal with a lot of the risk of transmission. It isn't going to be perfect, but if we, every flu season from here on out, mask up, then actually it takes care of a lot of different things from a public health perspective. And then also the other thing with density, and I saw some interesting reporting that came out of out of New York, specifically when it was going really poorly for them. And this is based further in the past, in another natural disaster in Chicago when there was a heat wave, and really people succeeded in both of those kind of very traumatic, devastating events that killed a lot of people if they were in denser neighborhoods with services and supports nearby. So that could be a doctor nearby, or a close doctor that you can rely on, neighbors that you can rely on, a grocery store nearby, those kinds of things which are associated with higher density, having those closer by, because more people rely on them, they can actually survive because they have enough customer base, I guess. But yeah, those kind of things are only going to occur when we have enough density. So it's actually more of especially, as we face more and more crises going forward, it makes sense to be in a denser environment because you have more supports nearby to be assisting you just in case shit hits the fan, kind of thing, like it did in March this year.
I guess just to ask you kind of a different high level question, do you think there's going to be as much of a change in living preferences attributable to something like COVID-19 as would be attributable to that Chicago heat wave? Because that strikes me as something kind of unique to that urban center, whereas COVID-19 is kind of impacting every place you could possibly live.
Yeah.
So you're asking if there's a difference between those two, or?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess I'm asking, do you think there's going to be a significant change to people's living preferences because of COVID-19 that's similar to that Chicago heat wave? Or do you think because the universality of the virus in a lot of countries, do you think that's going to kind of mitigate those changes?
So I think there's I think there'll be evidence of it on both sides. I think people will be pretty vocal, and those who love the suburbs will be like reinforced with like their enamorment with like living in a place where you have your own little pie of heaven and a green space in your backyard. But then I guess to answer your question directly, I don't think it'll change people's living preferences, but it may reinforce how people may be feeling already. I think like on the other side of preferences is like the actual thought of like costs and like how much it's going to cost to live in places. And if you think about like, especially, or my understanding is vested most prominently in the Canadian context. And, you know, for a lot of Canadian municipalities, like we're heading off a cliff, like financial wise, like budgets wise, like, you know, property tax breaks, like the inability to raise that really quickly, but then also like ever increasing costs with like, you know, funding transit while not pulling in like fare box revenue, and also providing all the same level of services, but not, you know, being able to pull in on other revenue streams like parking and that sort of thing. Like it's gonna be really spicy, and so it's gonna get to a situation where it's like, can we even afford to keep on building suburbs, because suburbs have never really like paid for themselves. They've always been like bolstered by like the growth that would continue to occur, but it's like we may be getting to a scenario where the affordability that's regularly present in the suburbs is like diminishing because it is no longer feasible to keep on building them out, because we're not growing at the same rate, we're not pulling in the same amount of revenue. Like we've really got to rethink like how municipalities work over the next little bit.
Mm-hmm. That's super interesting. I guess I'd be curious to know, like, so if you're saying that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but if you're saying that like suburbs are not necessarily pulling in their weight financially and aren't necessarily providing the incomes and revenues that these municipalities will need with, you know, really constrained budgets, where does that leave the future of housing? Like, are we going to look at more like, you know, internal, like things closer to downtown, condos, townhouses, like, and how do young people kind of fit into that equation?
Yeah. So like there is the piece of that where it's like, you know, you densify in the core and that can solve a lot of it. But like Canadian municipalities are like absolutely, I almost, but maybe that's not fair. But like,
don't worry, we can edit out anything that you don't like at the end.
You can keep it in there, but I want it to be in there and be like, I almost said that, but then I didn't, because we can give a little bit more credit where it's due. But horrible at like actual efficient land utilization, and like all the way from downtown to like the edge of the city, like to the airport in Edmonton, like actually up until like the suburban fringe, basically. Like we have done a very, very poor job of actually efficiently utilizing land. And so there is so much potential outside of downtown too, to actually be infilling stuff. And so there's gonna, like, the city's passing a new municipal development plan in Edmonton specifically, and it charts a path to shifting how growth occurs. And so the market's kind of and developers have really got to come along for that. And so that may take a couple of years, but for young people especially, like we're not the people actually like developing the land right now. We're just looking for a place to live. And so there's you know, still options being produced right now in suburban places, but those are only going to get more expensive. So we're going to start looking for other options, I think, which is you know, in some ways I think our land use bylaw, which is what is used to govern, legislate and like regulate like land development, like what can you build where and what is inside of that. That's kind of got to get exploded, which is occurring in Edmonton. Like it's got to get way more streamlined. It's got to be way easier, because like really right now it would be a huge hassle for like an ice cream store to move in next to me, to like open up shop. But like really that doesn't have any impacts. Like it's not a big deal, and actually it'd be pretty cool. So like that sort of stuff should get way easier. And in that process, one thing that can be done is actually providing making it easier to like have a secondary suite or like build a garden in your backyard. Like those are really affordable things, like from a month to month sort of perspective, because really they're just like extra income for a homeowner, and then also can present a more affordable place to live for young people. Like that sort of stuff has got to be come easier, because I think we're going to be squeezed out of a lot of other places. So how do we make better use of what we have already?
One thing that was super interesting to me, and I think we have to kind of hit on now, is I feel like a lot of the ways cities were built and developed had to do with how people worked, right, and where people worked. So, like, to kind of address the elephant in the room, if post-COVID people actually start working from home more and we have more remote working, a lot of those services that you spoke about in denser areas that kind of came about because everyone was working there, like, your coffee shops, your hospitals, your more public transit, all of that was because a lot of people were congregating downtown to work there. If actually more people do work remotely and there's that spread in our population, how is that going to I guess my first question is, are municipalities thinking about that? And how are they going to address that? Is that going to help with some of the affordability issues as well?
Yeah, yeah, no, it is a really good question. And I think, like, no matter where we live, like, we want to have access to that kind of stuff. Like, it's really great to be able to walk 15 minutes, or for me, like, I walk 2 minutes to a grocery store. I love that. I can, like, go grab something I forgot for dinner and just walk on over. So not everybody wants to live 2 minutes from a grocery store, but like a 15-minute walk is beautiful. So, like, yes, municipalities are, like, thinking about this in the way that they've designed neighborhoods up until this point, like probably from the mid 2000s to like now. They've tried to integrate greater mixed use or provide connections for all modes. So that's like walking, biking, driving, like provide proximate connections to like commercial sites. So you could actually, be working from home and then meet at a coffee shop and not have it be a huge hassle and have to drive for like half an hour to get somewhere. So on that end, I think, yeah, municipalities are thinking about that, and that's probably going to get even more accelerated in that, like, I'm trying to think. The land use bylaw, like, can get out of the way of some things, and like that ice cream store like down the street, like, could actually open because it wouldn't have to be this huge hassle. Like, it wouldn't have to go through a fulsome redevelopment process and like traffic pattern analysis and that sort of thing. Like, cities will need to like make those processes easier so we can have those services closer to home. And it's like the same conversation with like density, like making that sort of stuff easier, because yeah, once we actually start integrating it, we see that there aren't a huge number of like issues created for neighbors or that sort of thing. Like, it's really just having like another kind of neighbor who has like a couple different sort of characteristics. Like, maybe instead of having traffic parked out front of their house from 5 p.m. to like 8 p.m. or 8 a.m. when they're home, like, they have traffic out front during the day, which is actually like more efficient in some ways. So, yeah, from that land use piece, like, we're always going to want stuff nearby. So municipalities are trying to make that easier in the way that like we facilitate the development process.
Right. Well, I mean, if we're always going to want stuff nearby, one thing that I've thought of / have read, so I was listening to a podcast and the gentleman was, talking about how he uses, and Tony, this will probably be relevant to you as well. You can weigh in on this as well. He uses a, bigwig corporate law firm in New York, and he's like, they do amazing work. They do all the work that I need. But during the pandemic, they've been just as good, if not better, with everything working from home. And now I'm like, so let me get this straight. Like, you're going to charge me these really, really huge premiums to help pay for rent at this Manhattan apartment, right? When you can all do this from home. So I guess my curiosity around that is like, do you think, one of the things we talked about was like, okay, having services close by to your home. So having a grocery store close by to your home, having a gym close by to your home, all the things that an individual might need, right? Do you think that we'll also see the rise of like co-working spaces in suburban areas and using professionals utilize those co-working spaces?
Yeah, absolutely. I like that list that you were just starting to. Like, for me, it's like gym, grocery store, liquor store. Like, those are the three things for young people.
The essentials for the Cusp generation.
The essentials nearby. But actually, like, co-working is a really good, fourth piece to that. Especially like, young entrepreneurs who may not be able to like afford a space or have a business that makes sense to have its own space. Like I said at the beginning, I work at the City of Beaumont, and there is like co-working spaces in Beaumont. There is co-working spaces in Leduc, my hometown. I didn't mention that off the top, but I usually
represent.
Yeah, legendary Leduc. But yeah, there's co-working spaces in these very suburban communities, and I think we're only going to see an increase of that because I think, like, you know, the way people run their businesses is changing, and that sort of piece makes more sense. So, or like having a co-working space and going there. So yeah, I think we see a big increase in that in municipal or like in suburban areas.
I guess just a little bit of a segue. I'm curious about this with Tony. Tony, do you think they're ever going to cut like these downtown corporate offices? Like, cause you work in like you've worked in law before, and I'm just like wondering, do you think they'll ever be like, we don't need to have this, or do you think it'll be kind of like we'll have it to meet clients and people can rotate in and out, but nobody will need to be there all at once?
Well, and I think Tom could speak to this too, but I think like any professional service is probably going to base that on what their clients do. So I think you already see a lot of, you know, clients, especially in Calgary, cutting the amount of commercial space they're renting, or I guess leasing, largely because they're transitioning a lot of, especially admin people, to just permanently work from home. So I think if you know, they're going to pay for what they need. I think, especially given the partnership structure of a lot of these firms, like it's typically older people and their sensibilities that are going to kind of win the day here. So even though there might be a lot of us in our 20s that are like, you know, I love working from home. Like I'm tech savvy. I can do this easily. A lot of the people in decision making positions might say, you know, I really like the FaceTime and yeah, I personally can't replace that. Kind of a different question, Stephen. I'm really interested in how you think climate change is going to impact living preferences and also just kind of environmental preferences in general and the Cusp generation or young people.
Yeah, I think like our sort of generation or people our age are aware of this, and I think are beginning to like assign costs and figure out how much it would actually be like how much it would cost for us to like live in certain places in the longer term. Like I think we're well attuned to actually think about the broader range of costs, like through transportation and housing. Like I think that's going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years, and like climate change is going to be a huge cost driver. Like it's going to increase the cost of like everything. And so in some ways, I would say that people our age would probably want to live with less so they could afford it. Like, you know, live with less space because then you don't have to pay for as many utilities. Don't necessarily have a backyard because like then you don't have to pay for watering the grass when like the cost of water like may spike or may not be available. I think those sorts of decisions are ones that we're going to be one of the first generations to really contemplate, like maybe when we're buying our first home, if we even buy a home. Like home ownership, I don't know.
Okay, we're going to get to that.
Ooh, okay.
That's spicy. Okay. Yeah. Keep going though, Stephen, you were saying.
Well, I think our generation or people our age though are really going to be just to reinforce, the first to be grappling with how climate change is going to make everything more expensive. So like, how do I make my budget work still? And we're going to factor that into the houses we live in, and even if we're like building a new house, like I think, low impact development or like, things like solar panels, like that's going to be things that may make sense if we're investing in a home for like, 40 to 50 years. Like if that stuff can begin paying us back, like those are decisions we totally be making.
Topic. All right, so
I'm done.
Rent or buy, man. This seems to be the biggest decision that I've been trying to face at this stage of my life, and I'm a big proponent of rent and then use your the rest of the money that you save and invest it in like diverse stock portfolios, ETFs, etc. Because a lot of time people don't take into consideration the total cost of home ownership. It's not just the mortgage cost, but there's like maintenance, property taxes, a bunch of other things that you don't have to think about if you're just a renter. And then we also have to think about like it seems to be a very cultural thing as well. Because in North America is this whole like it seems to be a rite of passage that you have to own a home or you're not like you haven't made it. You haven't made your American or Canadian dream. But in Europe, like a ton of people rent, way more people rent, and there's way less incentives for like full on home ownership. And I think the government they recognize that. So all of that preamble just to say is like, Stephen, are you a renter or are you a buyer?
For now, I'm a buyer. I think if we're to like zoom out and look at like everybody our age, I think there are groups of people within that who need the flexibility and may be able to like access ways to create wealth, like, investments and that sort of thing, where renting would make sense because like they don't want to get stuck somewhere for 20 to 30 years. So like there's that cohort of renters, which like I would fall into, but then there's people who are like very ready to like settle down still. I guess like to discuss a change or like to point out a change, I think beforehand, like my parents or our parents' generations of those people growing up in Canada, I think the decision weighed way more on home ownership. Like it was like like all of my parents' friends own homes. But I think when I'm an adult and I have friends, I would say it would be way closer to 50-50. So there's that sort of change that'll probably occur. Because yeah, it especially, I also would just say that like as a generation, I think we care less about shit, like owning shit, which is like a great thing. I love that. Like, but I think about like the car that I have and most of my friends who own cars, I'm not even sure where I parked it on the street. Like I just kind of leave it on the street for periods of time, and I'm like, okay, I hope there have been times where I've like walked a couple blocks and been like, I can't remember where I put this, and like that speaks to like some privilege right there, like that I'm able to afford a car but like not really have to think about it. But this has also been complicated by COVID, and so I don't use it every day anymore. But yeah, we care less about shit. So it's like the value of home ownership will probably be less. Like we will be less proud of a home because we value like connections and experiences more. So we would rather live closer to friends than like live in a house that we're proud of.
I think just to touch base on that as well. One thing that I've noticed when I talk to people about like the value of renting versus home ownership, I mean, home ownership, they're always like, yeah, well, you're going to get appreciation in your home ownership price. You can always sell it for more, make money off that. But with renting, argument that I've always heard in favor of renting is just people being like, yo, I don't know if I'm going to be in Edmonton in like 10, 15, 20 years or Calgary or wherever. And I don't know if I want to deal with property management and like renting my property out and then garnering revenues from that while I deal with renting another place in a different city. Right. And so it's like, it's almost like that the hassle cost is one thing. And honestly, that kind of touches on what you said, where it was like, we're not necessarily tied down to anything. We might not necessarily be tied down to a city. Right. So why would we want to literally tie ourselves with an asset there in the form of home ownership?
Yeah, I guess we've kind of been circling around this idea that there are either like political or legal or municipal processes that can frustrate or I guess facilitate a lot of the development you're talking about. So if you do you have like a list of like top 5 things Stephen would want to see municipalities change to kind of make their cities more livable or better or affordable?
It's Christmas. Oh my God. I'm sitting on my wish list. It's my birthday. Okay. Well, I'll try to rattle off a few. I think one big thing is like redesigning streets, because those are like our most fundamental public space that ties everything together. So providing more space for people on streets instead of like cars specifically or vehicles. Like this kind of relates back to COVID, and I think it's something that we need to start grappling with and like pushing for, is that like commuting patterns have changed. So we'll probably introduce way more capacity in our system because not everybody's going to be heading downtown at 8 a.m. It's going to be a lot easier to get around. So we can start bringing back spaces for people, and that'll create a way more vibrant city. That'll create a safer city for people who can't afford a vehicle to get around.
Right.
That would be my number one. And then looking at the land use side, I think incentivizing development decisions that create a more equitable, affordable city, like making it easier to build density, making it easier to integrate affordable housing within a development, like those things should be prioritized. I guess the flip side of that coin is like de-incentivizing suburban growth, which like does experience like subsidization like as it exists right now. So like taking those incentives and placing them elsewhere would kind of be that third piece. And a fourth piece is probably, and this is where I can probably tack it off, is like having community conversations. That sounds so lame, tacky, like what does that even mean? But like, you know, bringing people along for this sort of change in how we build cities, because I think I've said a lot of stuff in this conversation where it's like, we need more density, we need this, we need that, and it represents a lot of change for how our cities would work. And change is naturally scary for most people. I get excited by change, I love it, but our whole world is going to change a lot over the next little bit, and it also just changed a lot in these past like 8 months. And so our cities need to be just as dynamic as that change. So having conversations that can actually bring people along to be better positioned to experience that change, and also to like bring in insights that they may have for their community to hear that change occurring, is the most positive possible.
Okay, so that's the end of our conversation with Stephen Raitz. A big shout out and thank you to Stephen for coming on the pod. We really appreciated the chance to speak with Stephen. You know, he's clearly very knowledgeable and passionate about issues in relation to urban planning and city design and what have you. And, you know, it was just great having him on the pod. So thank you. Next up, we have Jason Ribeiro, who is the Director of Strategy at Calgary Economic Development, amongst many other hats that he'll get into. And we have a great conversation about, you know, the city of Calgary and other trends in living preferences that he's seeing in other cities, as well as, you know, different economic trends that he's seeing. It's a pretty wide-ranging chat. So yeah, enjoy.
Yeah, my name is Jason Ribeiro. I wear a few hats in the city. You know, the first is as Director of Strategy at Calgary Economic Development. So I lead all of our core research with an amazing team, but I also lead the implementation of our community's economic strategy called Calgary and the New Economy, which really is about embracing digital technologies to solve really big challenges in the world. And aside from that, from the hours of 1 to 5 a.m. I'm finishing off my Ph.D. at the University of Calgary, specializing in leadership, policy, and governance. Also within the hours of, sort of 1 to 5, but also outside of those hours too. It just seems very visceral in those hours. I'm a new dad to a 5-month-old boy named Mateo, who's everything to me and has certainly put my role in perspective. And then other than that, I've just been very involved in our community from a board level, as a political commentator for a period of time, but then also as just hopefully someone who can lend a hand when people need it, and whether that's shouting out or promoting something that really is valuable to our city that people need to know about, or I'm the guy that you can call to help you move, and I'll begrudge you privately, but I will show up to do to help you out. So all of that is a very privileged position that I serve within this community that's really embraced me. So happy to be here with you guys.
Awesome, and we're happy to have you, man. We're happy to have you. So I guess, where do we want to start this conversation, boys? What are you thinking?
Yeah, I guess just to start off, because this podcast is really targeted towards that cusp generation, people between Gen Z and millennials, I'm really interested in how you engage with the shifts in preferences in those demographic age groups. Like how's that impacted your approach to solving problems related to social infrastructure, or just producing an effective social life in a city for people in that age group?
Oh, it's a great question. The obvious low-hanging fruit answer is that it helps that I happen to be in that group and in that age group. So it's the very real challenges that I think millennials, Gen Zs are facing. Those are the challenges that I'm facing. Those are the challenges that my friends are facing. People can't see this on the podcast, but I'm staring at three very handsome gentlemen, but also three people of color, and they're staring back at a guy also someone of mixed race, right? So it's a whole other lens to that it gets added to everything in your life, professionally and personally. And so I think from my perspective, largely being the youngest person in a room that I walk into, largely being in sometimes, depending on the issue or the topic, the only person of mixed race in the room, it's very top of mind for me. And I feel a responsibility, not just to sort of pat myself on the back that I'm in there and I get to weigh into these decisions, but how am I leaving this issue, this topic, this committee, this board, whatever, how am I leaving this better off and more welcoming of folks that might be younger or might look like me? I don't rest on the fact that I have some sort of cheat code here. I think we all this kind of needs to be democratized in a way. But as that concerns the direction of the city, look, the privileged position I have in leading our economic strategy, one of the reasons that I took on this role to lead it was because it had things like diversity and inclusion stated in the strategy. I don't know how many cities around the world have said, listen, one of the pathways that we have to greater economic prosperity is by being more diverse and more inclusive, not only in our way of thinking, but in who gets to make these decisions. But then also around recognizing the different preferences needed to build a city. What works in commercial core in Calgary might not work as you venture out east or into the south. And oftentimes you see different people, different demographic makeup. So it's something very top of mind that I bring to every decision we
make. That's interesting. I mean, you mentioned kind of differences that even occur on a provincial level. Do you think there are cities out there that are, in your words, like doing it right, that are models we could emulate? Or do you think what we have to do here is just kind of pave a new path forward for Calgary?
Yeah, it's more the latter. I think that we want to balance the best possible approach of looking at what works, what is objectively good in other areas, while also not wanting to, I think, get too starstruck or try and bring in solutions and import policies or approaches that might not fit the culture or traditions or ethos of what our city needs. Our city, since we're talking about, demographics and inclusion and things like that, people forget that Calgary is literally one of the most diverse cities in Canada. A third of Calgarians are visible minority. There's like 150 languages spoken here, and that is fastly extending throughout the city, rather than the one or two places that we often think about of that typically house people that are newcomers, et cetera. And so I think that there are micro things that we can take from other cities' responses to the social reckoning that just occurred throughout the United States, but largely throughout the globe. But on the macro and the meso levels, Calgary is Calgary, and we're going to dance with the one that brung us. It's got challenges, it's got beauty, it's got opportunity, it's got systematic problems around representation on boards and other things, and all of that represents the opportunity for folks like you, for folks like me, to lean in and be part of that difference. And so I think it's a bit of just reckoning with who we are, where we want to go, and then just forging the best and most inclusive path to get there.
One thing that's top of mind, and I kind of want us to address this elephant in the room, is all about COVID, right? So as someone who's in city planning, you're often thinking very long term. Most cities have Vision 2020, Vision 2030, etc. How has COVID probably upheld, we scattered all of that really and made that all kind of difficult, or has it accelerated the progress towards those visions? What has it been like living in this kind of post-COVID world?
It's interesting. Read into any subtext, every listener, to that interesting. Look, I think for, because even though we're, in my role, I'm engaged in things like, how we're theoretically, quote unquote, building out the city. Not a ton of my work actually deals in the nitty gritty of the urban planning realm. But that being said, I can comment on some of this policy and vision stuff. Helping lead the implementation of our economic strategy about jobs and economic prosperity and inclusion. I can give you a very real example of juxtaposing something that was actually formed in 2018 and how it stacks up again in 2020. And so if I back up to these longer term visions, the reason I took this position was essentially, I knew I had the research competency to lead our core research team, but it really was to tackle tackle this economic strategy question. And most cities have an economic strategy. And again, to your point, Tom, it's this long-term 20-year, 30-year vision. And forget about COVID. In most cases, after 5 years, some of that is irrelevant. It just is what it is. Change is coming fast and furious, and you either adapt or die. And so what was appealing about the economic strategy, Calgary and the New Economy, was it had this built-in understanding that we would be checking our assumptions within a 3 to 5 year time frame. And I said, that sounds about right. We had Boston Consulting Group and KPMG do a lot of the source research in partnership with Calgary Economic Development. We consulted 1,800 community and business leaders. So you had that bottom-up buy-in to the strategy, which is very different than some of the engagement that goes into a lot of other policies. And then you had this CEO roundtable of 25 leading business and community leaders that came together to really shape the implementation of this. And so City Council passes this strategy unanimously in 2018. I come in 2019 to help lead and steward that vision. Then COVID hits in March of 2020. And so here's what happened really quickly once COVID hit. You had crashing oil prices, which has a huge implication on Calgary's economy. You had challenges relating to food supply in certain areas of not only just in the city, but in the country. You had log-jammed supply chains, which didn't allow goods and services to flow pretty freely. And you had this global health pandemic, all vexing challenges that come at you fast and furiously. I went back to the economic strategy's vision during the midst of all of that happening. And word for word, this is the vision of the economic strategy. We aim to be the destination of choice for the world's best entrepreneurs who want to solve really heady global challenges like cleaner energy, safe and secure food, the efficient movement of goods and people, and better health solutions. At no time could you have predicted that there would be a better strategy to meet the moment of crashing oil prices, challenging food supply, log jams, and all of that vision is built on what Calgary is really good at. Calgary is a global energy powerhouse, but not just on the oil and gas and crude side. We're a globally ranked clean tech ecosystem. We have a clean resource innovation network that's $100 million of research aimed at low carbon energy that just got $100 million in additional federal support today. Four of the top 10 clean tech companies are in Calgary. Actually, there was a Calgary clean tech company in Rolling Stone magazine last month. Food supply, we're an agribusiness, leader. We have a fifth of the available farmland in Alberta. Health, we just invested in a life science innovation hub. Orpix, a Calgary company, just partnered with the government to produce 40 million masks in Alberta. From a supply chain perspective, we're known as an inland port that's really robust, which is why you didn't see these PPE shortages in Calgary. So all of that is to say, there was a lot of foresight in the strategy that we lead. There was a lot of openness and adaptivity to change, but there's a reason I put my name to this. And it was because I really did believe in the strategy. You would not see as many of the tweets and this energy that you're seeing coming through if I didn't actually believe in this. And so that is, I think, a model for which other cities, from urban planning to economic strategy to other realms, can really use as a a predictor for good success without being committed to some 20, 30, 40-year vision that's, almost irrelevant as soon as you commit it to paper.
I guess engaging with that foresight approach, I think I'm pretty confident speaking for people in our age group. I think a lot of us are not just thinking about, but worried about the digital economy and where we fit into that as we develop our careers. So I'm just curious how you approach the digital economy on that municipal level. And you might not be able to answer this, but if you had a checklist of like 5 things the provincial or federal government could do to kind of help Calgary engage with those issues, what would they be?
So I'll leave the latter because it's the more complex to the end. Because I could go in a lot of different directions there. But the first one around the digital economy. Look, I've said this. I've been involved even before I had this role in a lot of complex city building conversations, whether it was state of politics, the state of engagement, tax reform, whether to bid on the Olympic and Paralympic games. Like I've just been in the thick of it. And what I can tell you is that, and I mentioned it actually earlier in our conversation, like I just operate from this kind of adapt or die philosophy. And I think that there are things that we should be very critical of, very challenged by, very cognizant of as it concerns rapid digital transformation and the digitization of existing processes and industries and just core functions of how we lived our life. But the toothpaste is not going back in the tube. And so what I feel my role is, and certainly with a ton of my really hardworking colleagues, is how do we make sense of all of those changes? And I think part of what's so unique about Calgary compared to another market, one of these tier 1 type of cities, is much of what tech, or much of the role of what tech plays in their cities is big tech. What are these big behemoth companies going to do to the way that I go to school or interact at the grocery store, or it's the looming picture of Jeff Bezos's face coming to your city. Like that's certainly not, I think, the challenge that we have in Calgary, nor the opportunity. The opportunity that we have in Calgary actually is taking established industries, like the ones that I mentioned, which are going to be our established industries for some period of time: energy, agribusiness, transportation and logistics, increasingly life sciences, and then sort of saying, if those traditional quote unquote industries were to embrace technology, what would that mean for me? And part of the interesting conversations I have with CEOs and business leaders is they're reinventing what it looks like to work for an ag company, for a rail company, for a post-secondary institution. And all of those things, I think, are going to come with growing pains and challenges, but it would be better off to start with something that's part of the energy and the ethos of Calgary already, and slowly layer on, and in many cases, sometimes very rapidly accelerate technology onto that, versus saying, hey, this is coming fast and furious, and all of a sudden we're going to be, quote unquote, Silicon Valley North. That would be a much harder place to place myself in if I was a young person. Whereas right. Now, the likelihood is, and what we hope is, the relationship that one of your parents may have had with one of the largest employers in the city might be similar to the relationship you have with one of the largest or newest employers in the city, just on a different basis, powered by digital technology, your knowledge of it, and the business's acknowledgement that that's how they're going to continue to drive revenue. And so, again, I think we adopt that adapt or die philosophy, but we know that there's certainly going to be people displaced, certainly people going to be left behind, and that's where I think we play a role in being that bridge.
Yeah. So that's a great place to jump from. There's 2 things I want to talk about. One of them is more in relation to living and that marquee city thing you talked about. But the one thing that I thought of when you were talking about this, so with the implementation of technology into legacy industries, that's a phenomenal move from an economic standpoint, phenomenal move from a strategic innovation standpoint to, set ourselves up for success, not only 3 to 5 years from now, but, 10, 15, 20 years from now. The question that I have, though, is, what we see usually coming out of a recession, or at least, from my readings, what we see coming out of a recession is, if companies are investing in technology and are investing in ways to become more efficient, that might mean that there is less labor available in terms of like less jobs available for, like your traditional labor workers, and a lot more of a requirement for upskilling or tech upskilling, which usually also, like, let's be honest, requires less people, right? So I guess the question that I want to talk about is what does the human side of this transition look like, right? So we have the technical and the operational and organizational side of that transition. What would the human side of that transition look like?
Fantastic question, and one that I think we have to be very, very squarely focused on. One of the things that I often talk about with business leaders is that, growth for the sake of growth that sits on your balance sheet, but doesn't actually expand the pie or opportunity for a lot of people, might get you a feature in a magazine and might get you some good press, but it certainly won't build the kind of, I think, brand recognition, loyalty that many of the existing companies that have, really been the largest employer drivers for the last 20, 30, 40 years have had with people. And then one of the things, just a quick aside, is I almost feel like that's why some of the opportunities presented by tech and innovation-led companies remain still inaccessible to the whole swath of the city, is because, I still go to that Mother's Day walkathon and that pancake breakfast, and it's still sponsored by the same companies that have been doing it for 20, 30 years. And kudos to them, because they've even in a challenging structural change in our energy sector, or as their capital has become constrained, they're still fulfilling their responsibility to the community. And one of the things that I've pushed tech and innovation leaders on, I think we're coming to some agreement, is how do we get that kind of brand recognition within the city so that people feel, I think, that these opportunities are more accessible. But back to your question, look, this is about people at the end of the day. There's no such thing as economic growth or economic development or innovation that doesn't benefit people. So I think that I mentioned this in my earlier answer. We serve a little bit of a role as a bridge. So, for example, there's a structural change in the energy sector. Those very same energy companies, but also a large swath of just pure tech, transportation, logistics, you name it, kind of companies are rapidly embracing digitization and digital transformation. And so what that creates is a sort of leap for the skills that are needed and the skills that you have, and who's going to mine that gap. And so one of the things that we did from our lens at Calgary Economic Development, with a square focus on talent and getting companies the people that they need, but also people into jobs, was thinking about upskilling, I think, a little bit more uniquely. And so we did a skills competency mapping with our partners at ICTC, who are a big federal organization. And what we found was that many of the talented people working within the energy sector mapped from a competency and skill-based perspective to a lot of the emerging opportunities in tech. Because eventually, you talk about that efficiency, the growth curve is going to be for people that need, at the time, full stack developers, computer scientists, data scientists, et cetera, data analysts, and then the human skills of copywriting, you can go on. But where was that talent pool going to come from? And so for many people on the data side that were working with these huge spreadsheets, but also technology managing, volumes and volumes of resources and product on the energy side, mapped over quite nicely. So we created a program called Edge Up, which was literally, energy to digital employment opportunities, which is where we got the name, and started to reskill. We graduated our first cohort just recently, have launched a second cohort that was well received. There's programs like Evolve U, Lighthouse Labs. But to your point, this is gonna persist for some time. So even though there are people embracing digitization, we have to separate out those that are going to do a process more efficiently and for an optimization perspective, so that they can really, I think, drive value for their shareholders. But then there are going to be other ones that are just going to hire purely off the basis of they're not optimizing an existing industry. They've used technology to find a new solution that requires people. And so they just held an event with a company that's a great example of that. They're called Athenian. They're a legal tech company that provides software for paralegals to be able to more effectively, through technology in the cloud, manage legal entities. And that was something that, they're working on typewriters and microfiche and all this other stuff that didn't exist. So the people that they need, it's not an optimization. They need people writing that code, selling that product, and doing a lot of stuff. So I think we'll shake out somewhere in the middle over the next few years, where yes, some of those efficiencies will be driven. You'll still need new skill sets to be able to manage who's assessing what's efficient and not, what's optimal and what's not, with a good understanding of technology and data. But on the other side of things, there are companies that are purely scaling because they found a new opportunity through technology, and those are all going to be new hires that is to the benefit of the city.
Right.
So, Jason, you mentioned earlier on tier 1 cities and tier 2 cities kind of idea. Could you first of all kind of explain what that means to some of our listeners, how you define tier 1, tier 2? And on top of that, what cities do you think young people, millennials, Gen Z, those of us on the cusp, what types of tier cities are we moving into? And what are some of the things that are the decision criteria in picking those cities?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so at a high level, because I think there are multiple definitions of that. I think the first way that you delineate sort of tier 1 versus is tier 2 is on some basis of population density, et cetera. But I think from the perspective of if we're being pretty casual here, it's I'm originally from Stoney Creek, Ontario, which is I got amalgamated into Hamilton. I must have been 7 or 8 years old. And literally, I just remember knowing that as soon as I could, I was going to move to downtown Toronto. It just was going to happen. That was what it was. The moment we got our licenses, literally in high school, I shouldn't be saying this, but we would just leave for the entire day and just drive 45 minutes in the whip to Toronto and just spend a lot of time there and just come back to our high school 50 minutes to an hour away, depending on traffic. And so
that 401.
Oh God.
All the traffic.
It's you would have to wait till the Jays game or the Raptors game was done and then drive. You don't dare drive during the middle of that period. But Toronto is a clear example of a global tier 1 city. I would throw New York into that conversation. I throw Vancouver into that conversation, and increasingly I would throw Montreal there from a Canadian side. That's pretty much runs the table. But I think, and then and that's just again on those conversations on population density. I could even go into things like venture capital raises. I could go into other things around just pure investment in entertainment and lifestyle, et cetera. Mm-hmm. But also I think on the United States context, you could think about your New Yorks, your LAs. On the Europe side, Paris. So you can see where I'm going on the tier 1 kind of.
Yeah.
The tier 2 side is interesting because there have been cities from a land base or a population base that are still quite large compared to some of the cities I just referenced. But again, a little bit more sprawled out, a little bit of, going through a fast growth transition. When you think about Calgary, originally being not originally, but within short order, growing from a city of 500,000 people to adding 1 million people over a few decades is staggering. So those fast growth cities that are sort of in between what is a tier 1 city and the fact that, there's pretty good population density here in 1.5 million. We're not, in that 3 to 4 million category or 6 million category like some of the cities I mentioned. But at the same point in time, high livability, access to sort of anything that you would want. You guys are U of A grads in part. That's a world-leading, AI research team. But also the U of C increasingly, even though it's only 50 years and change, by every metric outperforms many of the universities in the country, but also ranks globally. We just don't consider it in that conversation because it's so young compared to other institutions. So that's the sort of delineation just culturally I would make. In terms of living preferences, coming from someone who eventually did make that trek to Toronto and lived a block away from Bloor-Yonge, and just lived the dream for a little bit. What I can say is it's interesting. I moved to Calgary from Toronto to do my Ph.D. It was the only reason I moved here. I found the supervisor I wanted to work with. I, finished my 3rd degree at the time of my master's and was going for 4, and said, I'm going to go to work with the best person possible that meets my needs. I don't care where it is. And so landed on Calgary. I didn't know a single person here. I knew one.
Where were you living in Calgary? Downtown? Like where in downtown?
Yeah. I'll give you the full lay of the land. So I knew one person here, and he was a buddy. We weren't exceptionally close, but we had this very shitty student house that when I went to Mac that we all lived in. And he was actually started as like a friend of a friend that was living there, and so we'd partied together. We didn't know each other super, super well, but we had the same group of friends. He was the only person, I swear to God, I knew in Calgary. And so he very graciously looked at the first apartment that I could find downtown that was close to the C train. It was Calgary Place Apartments. And you could tell, despite some of the suits that you see me wear, I am not bougie. I said yes to Calgary Place Apartments, sight unseen. He sent me
you know we're POCs here, right?
Yeah, it's true. So I said, 100%. I have no problem with that. I lived there for a year, access to the train, etc. And I really had no intention of living beyond my Ph.D. tenure of at the time, which was going to be 4 years. And so I was flying very much back and forth to Toronto, and never saw myself here. It was only after a year, and literally my day, I swear to God, was I would go take my classes, teach whatever courses that I was doing, go to the gym, go home, and that was it. And I would just rinse and repeat. I'm a very simple person. But I had no problem living there. Like I'm not bougie like that. Like I like being around people and like real people, and I had access to the train and was what it was. Anyways, I eventually moved to the Beltline Mark on 10th, which is a great building in the Beltline. That one's a little bougier, but nonetheless,
moving up.
Yeah, move. Yeah, after a year at Calgary Place Apartments, I decided to move on up. But nonetheless, I think some of the features of what I've learned just personally, and then what I think that means for trends is that, look, the defining factor of living right central downtown Toronto, where everything was at my fingertips at a moment's notice, where all my friends were, where every interest that I had, whether it be sports or concerts, or like I've gone to. My concert resume is it's A1. Like I'm telling you, like I've seen guys and gals I know you guys love before they were big at some shitty club. Just like literally everyone from a hip hop perspective you could think of. I was like, it was this embarrassment of riches being in Toronto.
Yeah.
And then I moved here, and like because our arena is not able to meet these new acts in their stages, like that was like a thing that I gave up. Was not being able to go to shows as often as I did. But so nonetheless, I sort of figured out, to me, eventually you move to cities that present opportunity to you. And while I had a great affection for Toronto, there's a practical reason to move to Calgary for the person that I wanted to work with. But increasingly, I saw that the city moved different. And again, this might be specific to me, but there's very much in Toronto in my dealings with it, a Laurentian elite, where you see people's names on boards, and you see someone and their son, and someone's dad used to be a politician and now they're in, like, you see a lot of that. In Calgary, I didn't see that. In Calgary, it just moved different. People were willing to see online that you were doing cool work and do exactly what you guys have done, is just like slide in the DMs or however this came to be, I forget, and just say, hey, you're doing really great stuff. I would love to chat or grab a coffee. And I'm telling you, it was C-suite folks all the way to like other students. And I've never been in a city that moved like that. And so increasingly, I think for me, it became this place of opportunity. And so to bring it up 10,000 feet to living preferences, I don't think in the data that we see that those fundamental things have changed for people. I think people might find opportunity and romance, not just in the aura of being in one of those tier 1 cities, but at the end of the day, people move for opportunity. And if the jobs are available in a particular place, or you're closer to your family, or you find a city that matches your interests, if you're a skier, a snowboarder, if your lifestyle requires you to have access to open green spaces, downtown TDOT is not going to be the best situation for you. But Calgary might be. And so I'll close by saying that from a millennial perspective, even going back to Gen X and others, eventually what we see happen is that while there are innovations in urban planning that allow for those 5-minute, 10-minute cities where everything is within your disposal, urban planning's gotten a lot better, where even if you're on the periphery of the city, You have access to retail, mixed-use buildings, that coffee shop, that local retailer, all that good stuff. People at the end of the day, we've seen at least in the data, want that sort of more suburban life and house, at least in the data, where eventually they make that change 30, 35 years old to go to that suburb, get more house. And that's where Calgary has an advantage because you can get more space than Vancouver, Toronto, or anywhere else more affordably. But I don't see that changing. It's more affordable. It's eventually those suburban communities are getting more complete in that they're getting more services, more amenities, and other things. And I think eventually what we're going to see around people getting that around the time, not you guys, when you're having the family, eventually, I don't know, maybe you guys are, but nonetheless, eventually that's where things hit ahead. And I haven't seen any large deviation from that. And so that's where Calgary could potentially have an advantage compared to those other cities.
Well, Jason, it's been a pleasure to have you. I'm being cognizant of time. We'll let you go in a sec. I guess, I mean, this is off topic, but I'm just curious. I mean, you are now in your 30s. You've kind of like, you're a little bit older than our typical listeners in the Cusp generation. Looking back at your, mid 20s, what sort of advice would you give to people like us? Like, is there any, wise words of wisdom, core values, whatever you want to say? What kind of advice would you give?
Jesus, I'm in my 30s. Let's level set for the listeners. I'm 31. All right, let's keep it real. I don't want to be a comedian here. This gives things like this give me energy, and I talk to as many graduating classes, people at school as I can. It's funny, only in the last month has a class actually asked me that exact question, and you now for a second time, and it was quite odd actually in the class. I didn't get emotional, but I got very reflective, and I think I would do a disservice if I didn't sort of take the same tact here, which is, look, when I was in my mid 20s, I was not in the frame of mind, on the path, mind, body, spirit that I am on now. I wasn't. And so I want to, there's so much pressure on young people to do X, to do Y, to do Z. And I think sometimes, seeing the one person that's, and again, this is social media and all this shit that's like winning or killing the game or all that sort of stuff can be intimidating depending on where you're at. I'll level set with you all very quickly and your listeners quite openly. When I was your age, everything I was doing drew me into the bottom of a bottle of scotch. I was not present for a single conversation that I had for years. I shirked every responsibility I could have had. With my running thing that people used to tell me is like, you have all this potential, you have all this and this and that. And I was just coasting, very much dealing with, a lot of interpersonal challenges, things at home, and a lot of stuff that I think if you were to look at my Twitter and all this stuff now, you would never have any idea of. And so in looking back at either myself when I was 24 or you guys and your listeners, the first thing I'll say is this is all fugazi. Don't think about, what you're seeing as what you need to be doing now. I kick myself sometimes over the things that I didn't shore up and get clean and live right and all this kind of things that I've sorted out. I kick myself for the time that I wasted, but I know ultimately going through all of these things led me to where I am sort of today. And so certainly don't beat yourself up if you happen to be in that position of working through all that stuff, because I was certainly in that position. But the only thing that I could possibly give any advice on is to be kind. I promise you, it is the simplest, most overlooked thing that you could possibly do. It's not necessarily being smart and or branding yourself right, it's just be kind. It is the biggest cheat code to life that you'll ever have in your interactions in business, in your interactions in the relationships that you have with your partners, your interactions that you have with family, with community. No one's telling you to be a saint. I'm far from it. But I'm saying to you, if you're coming out of an interaction and saying, I don't know if I was that kind, or if you're not going into an interaction knowing that you have all your faculties present to be kind, to be thoughtful, that no matter what happens, you're going to operate in this range of comfort that you're going to walk away with integrity, with thoughtfulness, and people are going to think good about you. That is the best advice I could possibly ever give you. And, I'm accessible, as you guys know. Ankur found me, but you guys, any of your listeners, I'm always accessible to talk through any of that kind of stuff, because I just think that there's so much pressure. There's a lot of challenges. I am one wrong move away at your age from not being here. One bad mistake, one night, in one circumstance, with the wrong people and everything like that. And I know for many people, that's also, it's that thin. And what a wasted opportunity that would have been for all the great things I get to be privileged to do right now. So be kind, be thoughtful, and everything else will come.
I love it. Thank you for opening up and sharing your story. And I think those are wise words at any age, let alone for us especially. So I really appreciate it, man. Thank you for both doing the spiel about CED and telling us about what's going on, but also opening up about your personal story. That we really appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on the pod. We really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure.
All right.
Pleasure.
Yeah, I mean, great conversations from Stephen, great conversations with Jason. I gotta give a big shout out to Jason at the end there for opening up. That definitely caught me off guard. But I appreciate when people feel comfortable enough to open up with us on the pod. I don't think anybody's really done it to that extent, but definitely appreciate it.
Yeah, we they held up under some intense questioning. We really grilled them. We really grilled them. I feel like Jason, dodged questions like a master at times, but then really, he level set it with us. He delivered the goods, and I feel like Steven was able to really engage with all the like softballs. We were throwing at him. No, but in all honesty, like the conversations were really interesting. I feel like we all learned a lot from both of these guys, and I really appreciated hearing their personal perspectives and stories about how they got interested into these topics, and also like just their off the cuff thinking about how they think these trends are going to continue to develop, and where they see their municipalities going from here.
Yeah, I really liked like Steven's conversation around the whole having all your essential services within like a 15-minute radius, right? The whole idea of a 15-minute city. And then also when he talked about, how different municipalities are thinking about their policies in terms of urban development, right? So some in the past, all these municipalities have just been going wider and wider, and it might not always be the best thing to just go wider and wider because you have the land, right? You have to find a sustainable model. I really appreciated that. And I don't think a lot of people think about that,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's certainly comforting knowing that we have people like this thinking about the future of our cities, and our municipalities, and I certainly hope it stays that way. I think something I was reflecting on kind of after we had these conversations was how COVID-19 really impacted or catalyzed a lot of these trends that both of them brought up, and we don't know what future trends are going to be, what's going to happen in 2021 or 2022. So it'll be really interesting. We have these predictions, we have these kind of notions about the type of city people want, the type of preferences our generation has. But I think it'll be really interesting seeing how those change as the next couple years unfold. We got to say, this is going to be the end of our first season. We'll be back early next year with some more content. We're going to take the break to kind of reflect on what kind of content all of you want, what kind of content we want to produce. So if you have any ideas or suggestions or feedback, like let us know. you can email us at the cuspod@gmail.com or hit us up on social media. And yeah, I gotta say personally, it's been like a really enjoyable experience producing this and putting this content out, especially like seeing the reception it's gotten from a lot of you, and
we've done it all virtually too.
Yeah, it's been wild.
I haven't met the boys in person in like, it's felt like years, but it's probably been like, well, Tony, I met you once briefly when I was up in Edmonton.
Yeah, for like 20 minutes.
Tom, I haven't seen since like February. We were watching the Democratic primaries at your house. That's the last thing I remember. Last time I remember meeting you.
Oh yeah.
That's how long ago it was. But yeah, it's been a journey. Like, real talk, we did not expect to be. I mean,
I didn't expect us to
13
get
episodes into a podcast.
What episode are we in now? I didn't
13 or 14.
Yeah, I definitely didn't expect us to pass like 7.
Yeah, we just wanted to start having conversations that we were already having in our group chat, just to have fun recording them. And then once we started recording, we realized, hey, there are some things that we want to talk about, and there's some things that you all want to listen to. And so we're really grateful for your listenership. And, like Tony said, we're going to take this break consciously to think about what kind of podcast we want to bring and really bring an awesome season 2.
Yeah, agreed. I agree with everything the boys said. I'm not going to sound like a broken record, but I think we were also pretty shocked at how much reception our episodes with guests have gotten, and also the kind of guests we've been able to attract. So, all of this is to say that in season 2, our guest roster is going to be a real banger. We're going to think big. We're going to reach out big. So, Obama, if you're listening, come on.
Hey man, he has a book to promote. I mean, we have readers.
Land? Sounds like a great
readers
book.
In the audience.
Come promote it.
He wanted to talk to young people about politics. Hey, if we had the first episode of season 2 with Obama, that's the goal.
Yeah, let's talk to Obama about his presidency. Let's talk to Bill Gates about like funding vaccines for COVID. This is the pod where those things need to get discussed.
100%.
We're gonna reach
Stephen
out to
Raitz,
people.
Jason Ribeiro, and Obama. That's the goal.
There you go. All right, we'll see you all in season 2. Have a great holiday.
Peace in the Middle East.
Bye-bye.